Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So we want to continue on with our Heckscher-Ohlin model. So remember, we put it together last time and just ran out of time, actually. So I just want to finish up with the slides that we had. So if you recall, essentially what we did is to start with assuming that two countries were identical in every way, and which meant that their production possibilities curves would look exactly the same. And then we endowed one of those countries with more capital and the other country with more labor. And we saw that by doing that, the country that had more capital would now have a bias production function in the direction of those goods that were capital intensive. And the country that had an abundance of labor would then have a bias production function in the direction of the labor-intensive good. And that meant that the capital-abundant country would also have a relatively large supply of the capital-intensive good, where the labor-abundant country would have a relatively high proportion of the labor-intensive good. So what we saw, just in some conclusion, is that an economy will be relatively efficient at producing those goods that intensively use the factors of production in which they have a lot of. So another way of thinking about that is that a capital-abundant country should have a high relative output of capital-intensive goods. And a labor-abundant economy would be able to produce a large quantity of labor-intensive goods. So if we look at our relative supply and demand curves, now we have to be careful here in terms of what we have on the axes. So notice on the vertical axis I've got the relative price of cloth, which is the labor-intensive good, and on the horizontal axis we have the relative quantity of cloth being produced. Cloth, as we discussed last time, is a labor-intensive good, and China was a labor-abundant country. So China will end up with a relative supply curve for cloth that is further to the right than is the relative supply curve for the U.S. Now notice that if we instead been looking at the relative price of machinery, and therefore the relative quantity of machinery, the relative supply curve of the U.S. would be further to the right. Okay? So we always have to make sure we know what's on our axes when we're drawing these two, when we draw these two curves. So notice then that at any particular relative price of cloth, China is going to produce more cloth, higher relative quantity of cloth, than will the United States. They've got lots of labor, they're going to produce more cloth, which is labor intensive. The other thing that you can see here is the relative price of cloth is going to be lower in the labor-abundant country. So in the capital-abundant country, we end up with a low relative price of the capital-intensive good, while in the labor-abundant economy, a low relative price of the labor-intensive good. So knowing something about factor abundance tells us, and something about factor intensities of the goods, tells us something both about the relative supplies as well as the relative prices. Now notice that in this regard, we've got differences in relative prices, which means that there are gains to be made from international trade. And we've assumed that there are no differences in labor productivity. So the Ricardian model only looks at differences in labor productivity. The Heckscher-Ohlin model only looks at differences in factor endowments. We can assume that labor productivity is exactly the same in both countries. So that then would give us our Artarchy Heckscher-Ohlin model in our two countries. So a couple of things to notice here. The relative price of cloth is lower in China than it is in the United States. Okay? Because of that, the relative wages in China, wages relative to the return to capital, is also much lower in China than it is in the United States. And in fact, given the Stolper-Samuelson relationship, the gap in returns to the factors of production is bigger than the gap on the relative prices. Now, it may not look that way given the way I've drawn it, but actually it does look that way. And of course, the other thing that we see is that the capital-labor ratio in both industries will be smaller in China than they will be in the United States. Not surprising, right? The U.S. is capital-abundant, so they're likely to have a higher capital-to-labor ratio in both industries. Also notice, given our assumption that machinery was capital-intensive, that both countries have a higher capital-to-labor ratio in machinery than they do in clothing. So we've got lots of things going on in this particular diagram. So we can put together then all of this information, our production possibilities frontiers. Okay, so this is Artarchy. Which country is this? This is the U.S. We know that because the production possibilities frontier is biased towards machinery, and the U.S. is capital abundant, and machinery is capital intensive. This is China, just the opposite. China is labor abundant. Cloth is labor intensive. Therefore, we have a production possibilities frontier that is biased towards cloth. Remember also that the bias of the production possibilities frontiers also tell us the country's comparative advantage. So we can tell immediately just by looking at these two charts that the United States has a comparative advantage in machinery and China has a comparative advantage in cloth. Here's our Artarchy relative prices. Again, the relative price of cloth in China is much lower than it is in the United States. And it's those differences that will allow us to gain from international trade. And then finally, our Heckscher-Ohlin diagram as well. So now what we want to do is thinking about these four. Notice we now have four diagrams for Artarchy. A production possibilities frontier for each of the two countries, a world relative supply and demand curves, as well as our Heckscher-Ohlin diagram. So now we want to ask what happens when we open up the economy to international trade. Well, as we saw with the Ricardian model, when we open it up to international trade, there will be a convergence of relative prices. So for exactly the same reason, arbitrage opportunity between countries means that machinery producers in the United States find that they can sell machinery at a higher price in China than they can in the United States, so they're going to export some of their output. That will increase the quantity of machinery in China, driving down the price of machinery there, and also reduce the quantity of machinery available in the United States, pushing up the price domestically. Chinese producers see just the opposite. Cloth is selling for much higher prices in the United States, so Chinese cloth producers are going to export part of their output to the U.S. Additional quantity of cloth in the U.S. will drive the U.S. price down and drive the Chinese price up. So what we end up with then is a situation where we have a convergence of the relative prices to something between where we were before, that is before opening it up to trade, we're somewhere between our Tarky prices. So the relative price of cloth rises in China and falls in the United States. This also tells us then that we have a world relative supply curve that lies between the relative supply curves of the two countries. Okay. So notice then that the first thing we do when we open it up for international trade, we want to look at our world's relative supply and demand curves, because that's where we determine what happens to the relative price. Now we can go back and say, okay, what effect does this have on each of the two countries? What effect does this have on their production choices, their consumption choices, their imports and their exports, as well as their level of aggregate economic welfare? So those are all the things that we now want to look at. So here's our diagram for the U.S. in our Tarky. So in our Tarky, we're producing at point A, which gives us a supply of S sub M machinery in S sub C cloth. That is also where we're consuming, because in our Tarky, you can only consume what you produce domestically. So demand equals supply in both of those conditions. Now, what's happened in the U.S. is that the relative price of cloth has fallen. Okay? But the slope of our ISO value budget line is not the relative price of cloth. It's actually the relative price of machinery. We know that because we have machinery on the horizontal axis. So again, we always have to be careful about what ratios we're talking about. So in this case, this also implies, of course, that the relative price of machinery has risen. If the relative price of cloth falls, the relative price of machinery rises. What happens then to the slope of the ISO value budget line? Either gets steeper, flatter, or it stays the same. Okay, so the ISO value budget line now becomes steeper. So we now have a slope that's equal to the new world relative price of machinery rather than the autarky price. So notice what happens then. At this higher price for machinery, businesses will want to produce more machinery. So the quantity of machinery being produced, or the supply of machinery, increases. Well, obviously, to increase the production of machinery, in the U.S., we have to reduce the production of cloth. So cloth production declines. So we're now at point B in terms of production. Now remember, how much we produce also tells us what our income is. So point B tells us our income, but now we have to decide where do we want to consume. And our consumption pattern can be driven along the ISO value budget line. We've got the relative prices, that's the slope of the budget line, so we can actually consume anywhere along that budget line that we want to be. So what we want to find, of course, is the highest country indifference curve that we can get to. So that'll be up here. CIC naught. And now we're going to be at a point like C. So notice that at point C, we're actually consuming less machinery. The relative price of machinery has risen, and we're consuming more cloth because the relative price of cloth has fallen. Well, if we consume more cloth than we are producing domestically, we have to be importing the difference. And if we're producing more machinery than we're consuming domestically, we have to export the difference, or we do export the difference. So notice here that we started with different relative prices, which then begin to converge as we open up to international trade. By opening to international trade, our export good rises in relative price, our import good falls in relative price. Because our import good is falling in relative price, we're going to consume a lot more of it, and this change in relative prices allows the country to move to a higher country indifference curve. So we can easily say that the country itself is better off. Yes? As opposed to any place else? Oh, okay. Okay, so generally speaking, we know two things about how consumption patterns change when relative prices change, right? So the first thing we know is the relative price of cloth goes down. So that should tell us downward sloping demand curve, we should buy more cloth, right? So notice that I've got cloth consumption going up. We also know that the relative price of machinery went up. Generally, when relative prices rise, the relative quantity consumed will go down. So in this case, I've got the consumption of machinery falling. Now, as you know, when you have changes in relative prices, well, hopefully you know, there's both income effects and substitution effects from the price change. So what this pattern actually shows is that the substitution effects more than offset the income effects. The income effects would say you would buy more of both goods. The substitution effect says you'll buy more of the cheaper good and less of the more expensive good. For most products, if there is only a relative price change, the substitution effect will be greater than the income effect. So you end up consuming more of one good and less of the other good. Okay. Yes? Yes, for most products, the substitution, for a relative price change, for most products, the substitution effect will outweigh the income effect. Yeah, so what we know for sure is what happens to relative values, not necessarily to absolute values. So you're right, we don't know absolutely that this will fall, but more likely than not, it will. So what we can say about absolute income and substitution effects, we can also say about relative income and substitution effects. Okay, anything else? Okay, so why don't you work out what happens in China? Right, this is China's case. So why don't you take a few minutes and work that out? and then we'll come back to that real quickly. Okay, everybody got it worked out? So what happens first? Okay, so again, the first thing that's going to happen is we've got a change in relative prices, so that change in relative prices is going to change the ISO value budget line, which becomes flatter or steeper? Flatter. Okay, so here's our new ISO value budget line, which has a slope of the world price of machinery. So notice then, to maximize the value of our production, we're going to move to a point such as B, producing a lot more cloth and a lot less machinery. So notice that in this particular model, with Bode production possibilities frontiers, countries do not fully specialize like they do in the classic Ricardian model. China is still producing some machinery, just as the US is still producing some cloth. And of course, we now want to get to find out where consumption is. So we can find where the country indifference curve is tangent to our new budget line. And we see that, in general, the demand for cloth will go down, and the demand for machinery will go up. And we consume at a point such as C. Once again, we see that, in this case, China will be importing machinery, which, if drawn accurately, would exactly match the exports of US machinery, and China will be exporting cloth, which, again, if drawn accurately, would perfectly match the US's imports of cloth. Once again, we can see the gains from trade by having moved to a higher country indifference curve. Now, the pattern of trade that we end up with shows the capital-abundant country, in this case the US, exporting the capital-intensive good, machinery, where the labor-abundant country exports the labor-intensive good, cloth. That particular conclusion, or seeing this particular conclusion, is actually what's known as the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Notice the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem doesn't actually even address the Heckscher-Ohlin diagram that we had earlier. You could do all of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem just using production possibilities curves and world relative trade and, relative supply and demand conditions. So again, we export the good that's intensive in our abundant factors, and we import those goods that are intensive in our scarce factors. Okay. Now, what happens to relative factor prices? We've seen what happens to relative goods prices, but now we want to know what happens to relative factor prices. So notice that we've started, this is the same as our autarky diagram from before. We've got US autarky relative price of cloth and China's autarky relative price of cloth as well. What we saw is that relative prices are going to converge. So the relative price of cloth rises in China and falls in the United States. On the basis of the Stolper-Samuelson relationship, the relative wage in China should rise and the relative wage in the US should fall. For now, we won't worry about what happens to factor proportions on the right-hand side. Notice that if we take this to its logical extreme, what it says is that if relative prices